This meme was getting a bit of play in one of my Facebook groups recently. Not because of the meme itself, but because of Facebook's reaction to it. Beneath the meme, Facebook posted this notice. False. Gun control regulation in Germany did not help advance the Holocaust. Now, this is a Politifact article produced in partnership with Facebook as part of their program to combat the dissemination of fake news. And I thought it was a little surprising that Facebook would regard this meme as important enough to be worth an official fact check, but here we are. The article was published April 8th. It's by a Miss Samantha Putterman, and it makes three main claims. First, that it was the Weimar Republic and not the Nazis who introduced gun control in Germany. Second, that Hitler actually relaxed gun control policies. And third, that even if the Jews hadn't had their guns confiscated, it wouldn't have made a difference anyway. So let's take these points in turn. First, was it the Weimar Republic and not the Nazis who introduced gun control in Germany? Yes, it was. But take another look at the Politifact headline, which says gun control regulation in Germany, not only Nazi gun control regulation in Germany. It doesn't matter who introduced the gun control regulation. The important fact is that it was there. It was part of German life in the years leading up to and then during the Holocaust. And no one, so far as I know, on either side of the question is arguing that gun control was only good or only bad or only counts if it was introduced by the Nazis. When Hitler's SA, the brown shirts, began marauding the streets and beating people up and vandalizing their shops and homes and murdering them throughout the 20s and the early 30s, the law-abiding German citizen found himself without any private means of self-defense. So we have to rate the first Politifact claim as non sequitur. It does not follow that gun control had no bearing on the Holocaust simply because it was not introduced by the Nazis. In fact, it's no argument in gun control's favor that the first restrictions were passed by a liberal democratic government shortly before its collapse into a totalitarian dictatorship. What about the second Politifact claim? That Hitler relaxed gun control policies. Well, yes, he did, but only for non-Jewish Germans. And I don't think it's the non-Jewish Germans who are referred to in the meme. Now, in 1938, Hitler did pass legislation that made it easier for Germans to own guns, but the same year, he also introduced restrictions against Jewish weapons ownership. In fact, a blanket regulation that forbade all Jews to own weapons of any sort, guns, knives, or anything else. And so it's not much of an argument to say Hitler expanded gun ownership for everyone except the groups he intended to victimize. If gun control relaxation didn't apply to the victims of the Holocaust, it's not relevant to the victims of the Holocaust. But we can go a little further afield because the Politifact article ignores, or maybe they just don't know, that German lawmaking, thanks to Hitler, was not exclusive to Germany. And everywhere the Germans went, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, the Germans immediately confiscated all privately held firearms. And they were aided in these confiscations by the gun registries that all these countries had established before the war when they were still liberal democracies and constitutional monarchies. And it's kind of a tragic irony that the gun owners in these countries, by obligingly registering their weapons, made it easier for the Nazis to take them away. Now, here is an exemplary poster, Nazi poster from Holland, informing the citizens that all firearms and ammunition are to be surrendered within 24 hours. And here is a similar one from France, confiscation of guns and radio transmitters, which go hand in hand as elements of personal agency. It says, all firearms must be surrendered within 24 hours. All those who disobey this order will be condemned to death. So that's 24 hours to choose between life and gun ownership because the Nazis were afraid, were terrified of privately held guns, and they regarded gun control as a vital tool of political oppression. So is Hitler really anti-gun control? Hardly. He may have confiscated more guns from more people in more countries than any man in history. And so we have to rate the second Politifact claim as false. But what about the third contention? That even if the Jews hadn't had their guns confiscated, it wouldn't have made a difference anyway. Now here I think Miss Putterman's piece really is swirling into the clogged toilet bowl of confusion. On the one hand, she's written that guns were largely confiscated before the Nazis came to power. On the other hand, she says after the Nazis came to power, there weren't enough guns to make a difference. Now, I might logically conclude that if gun policies had been less restrictive before the Nazis arrived, there might have been more guns after, perhaps even enough to make a difference. But my logical conclusion, just like Ms. Putterman's assertion, is a hypothesis, is not a fact. It is an open-ended historical question on which we're free to argue and debate and conclude what we wish. And we may even conclude that we just don't know. And I think that's the problem with Ms. Putterman's article. It's not the worst written op-ed I've ever read, but it's certainly an op-ed, an opinion, editorial, masquerading as a statement of fact. It takes an important and complex historical issue and then declares that the truth has been established beyond dispute. Now, only dictators and children have such a touchingly simplistic view of the truth. Though I don't mean to suggest, of course, that Ms. Putterman aspires to be a dictator. But the difficulty with political fact-checking is that political issues that have any degree of nuance whatsoever don't lend themselves to a simple true or false verification or validation. It's not as though the Democrats have said the Empire State Building is 1,400 feet tall, the Republicans say it's 1,500 feet tall, and all we have to do is look up how tall it actually is. If politics were that simple, we wouldn't need any debate or any discussion, or for that matter, any elections. Let me quote from the article itself. Even if they had weapons, Jews probably wouldn't have had much success fighting back. Though probably. What happened to facts, to true or false? What we have here is a conjecture. Someone is telling us that because the chances of success were low, we may assume that failure was inevitable. Now that's precisely the attitude that obtained in much of Britain's government in 1940, as embodied in the person of then Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, who was Chamberlain's first choice to succeed him as Prime Minister. Chamberlain didn't like Churchill. Neither, of course, did Hitler, though for very different reasons. But Hitler had assumed that after his lightning conquest of France and France's astonishing collapse in June 1940, Hitler took it for granted that Britain would want peace. A peace which would leave Britain intact at the expense of a permanently Nazified Europe. And if Halifax had become Prime Minister, Hitler might have gotten his deal. But fortunately for the world, Halifax demurred. He felt that he could not be an effective Prime Minister from the House of Lords, so he recused himself, and the leadership devolved on Churchill. And Churchill proceeded to infuriate Hitler and save the world by refusing to acknowledge the inevitability of history. Which is not to say that Churchill was certain he could beat the odds. On the contrary, he made every preparation for disaster. They expected the Germans to invade the British home isles, and Churchill tells us that the slaughter on both sides would have been both grim and great. They were prepared to go all lengths. Churchill says he intended to use the slogan, "You can always take one with you." And Churchill also tells us that the British Home Guard overtopped the 1,000,000 mark, and when rifles were lacking, grasped lustily the shotgun, the sporting rifle, the private pistol, or when there was no firearm, the pike and the club. Churchill regarded it as a tremendous boon that Britain, in these sterner days, still retained some vestige of private gun ownership, which was supplemented in the first years of the war by gifts from Americans of their private guns, in the hope that when the Germans came, the British citizen would not be lacking for tools with which to defend himself. And so we have to consider this third Politifact contention, that it wouldn't have made a difference anyway, as nonsense, or at any rate as an opinion, not as a fact. that can be called true or false. And the fundamental issue here, the reason this was getting so much discussion in the Facebook group, has nothing to do with gun control or the Second World War. It's about this partnership between Facebook and Politifact, which, if we take them at face value, are two well-meaning organizations, but here dedicated not to making sure that you have all the facts, but to making sure that you draw the right conclusions, the correct conclusions. And I don't think that is a task which any organization, private or public, ought to perform for us. It's a job for each individual, thinking, voting citizen. It's our task to seek out the information and determine for ourselves what we believe. Even if we may make mistakes or come to the wrong conclusions, even if we might be tricked by a misleading or dishonest story. Anyone can write a story, anyone can read a story, and anyone can think about that story and evaluate it for himself. And that, I think, is the essence, or even the definition of freedom. So the next time you see a Politifact piece, you might rate it, at least in your own mind, not as true or false, but as opinion, because that's what it will be. A masquerading opinion, the effort of whose further evaluation rests on us. And it's nice of Facebook to want to relieve us of that effort, which can be very hard work. It's a question, just as is gun control, of our being willing to give up a responsibility which we may feel the general public is not capable of handling, or can't be trusted to handle. As a free society, we may collectively decide to give up any responsibility we currently have, from gun ownership to unrestricted freedom of the press. But even if these responsibilities are burdensome, and even if they're sometimes seem more trouble than they're worth, we should think carefully before handing them over why we were given them in the first place. Because any freedom, no matter how small, is 100 times easier to give up than it will ever be to get back. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, or even if you hated it but watched all the way to the end, please let me know in the comments below, or subscribe for more questions on culture, policy, and history.